Today's devotion from Christ in Our Home, dated Tuesday, April 27th. The prayer concern is for Lutheran social services in America. The title of the devotion is Open Our Hands. I will read from Revelation chapter 7, verses 14 through 17. And he said, "These are they who have come out of the great tribulation. They have washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. Therefore, they are before the throne of God and serve him day and night in his temple. And he who sits on the throne will spread his tent over them. Never again will they hunger. Never again will they thirst. The sun will not beat upon them, nor any scorching heat. For the Lamb at the center of the throne will be their shepherd. He will lead them to springs of living water, and God will wipe away every tear from their eyes." The written devotion says, "No hunger, thirst, or tears sounds good. However, because my needs are well met, this promise seems less urgent to me than it might to many people. A future without needs may be somewhat comforting to my neighbors facing ordeals, but what about their needs and tears now? I worked with a group whose goal was to end long-term poverty. It was criticized as anti-biblical because Christ said, 'You will always have the poor with you,' from Matthew 26:11. For clarification, Christ was quoting Deuteronomy 15:11, which continues, 'Open your hand to the poor and needy neighbor to end their poverty.' And the exact verse says, 'There will always be poor people in the land. Therefore, I command you to be open-handed toward your brothers and toward the poor and needy in your land.' We await plenty in the kingdom to come. Yet we also believe the kingdom is here now. Christ declared that in him the kingdom of heaven has come near. Matthew 4:17. Thus, what is our call in the kingdom now? Is it enough to tell our neighbors they will have plenty in the kingdom to come? Instead, how can we open our hands and meet our needs and wipe away their tears now? Let us pray. Loving God, thank you for your promise of the kingdom to come and for empowering our work in the kingdom now. Amen. Okay.
Thank you very much, Sherry. And I'd like to give a couple more pieces of instruction before we move to our speaker. But first, I would like to say that everyone should mute their sound and also turn off their video. But what you need to know is when we get to the question period of the session, please write your questions in the chat box that's at the bottom of your screen. And Nancy Olson will be reading the questions and reading them for our speaker to answer. And now I would like to say first thank you to Gracia Goodall for calling our attention to Mark Granquist, that he is a professor of history of Christianity at Luther Seminary. And he has an interesting perspective to share with us about Hans Nilsen Hauge. So thank you, Mark Granquist, for being with us, and we look forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Marilyn. I appreciate that. I'm hoping that you can all hear me well. If not, please let me know on that. First of all, I would like to thank you for inviting me to be here with you today. I'm looking forward to this time. I bring you greetings from your partners in ministry at Luther Seminary, and we thank you for the um, the cooperation that you and so many other people have with our work of raising up pastors and leaders for the Christian church for the future. I also want to say thank you very much for allowing a Swede to talk about Hans Nielsen Hauge and his legacy. Uh, Gracia will be around to correct me at the end if I slip into any uh, Scandinavian errors. Anyways, but so what I would like to do today is I would like to think about um, the legacy of Hans Nielsen Hauge. And it's it's not necessarily an easy thing to think about his legacy. And here's the reason. Because Haugeanism, by definition, is a movement rather than an institution. Okay? And we'll talk a little bit more about this. And so it's much harder in terms of putting your fingers on things to say, well, this is Haugeanism or this isn't, or other sorts of things like that. I actually had a PhD student several years ago, Tom Jacobson, who wrote an entire dissertation on the continuation of Haugeanism in the 20th century in the United States among Norwegian Americans. And it's a lot harder to do than just to point to this building or that organization or this denomination or something along that lines. So first, a few things on Hauge, and then I want to look, since the continuation of Hauge is more in people than in institutions, I want to look at the lives of four people who were Haugean. All right. So the specifics on Hauge, and many of you know these general specifics. He was a lay evangelist. He was never ordained as a pastor. And the lay preaching is going to become very important for the Hauge movement. As a young man, he underwent a conversion experience in 1796. He was out plowing in a field and had this sudden experience of God's grace. And he felt that God was calling him to proclaim the gospel. Now, this is a problem because in the 19th century, 18th, 19th century in Norway, as in the rest of Scandinavia, preaching and evangelism was reserved to the ordained clergy. And to be an ordained pastor, you had to go to the university and become ordained in the state church and other sorts of things like that. Hauge felt that that was not his calling, but it was his calling to proclaim that gospel that had captivated him. He was dissatisfied with the spiritual state of Norway at the time. He was dissatisfied with the Church of Norway because he felt it was not addressing this spiritual problem within the society directly. That the clergy were not captivated by the Word of God in the way that he felt Christian leaders ought to be. And Hauge traveled throughout Norway from 1796 to 1904, only 8 years. but his preaching was powerful and grabbed the imaginations and the hearts of many people. And but it obviously got him into trouble with church and state, because preaching, lay preaching without authorization, was a crime in that period of time. He was imprisoned in various modes for 10 years for doing this preaching. Uh, and he continued to write and to advise people, send letters and things like that. But his health deteriorated rather dramatically. And when he got out of, finally out of prison, and then was released from home arrest, he could not maintain the kind of lay preaching that he had in the 8 years from 1796 to 1804. The Hauge movement, the Hauge ideal became a movement in Norway. Now, it's very important that it stayed, because he insisted on this, it stayed within the Church of Norway. He did not, he advised he advised his followers not to develop separate church or separate congregations. Now, what they did, however, is because of the hostility of some of the priests. Now, some of the priests in the Church of Norway were very sympathetic to the movement, others were not. And they developed what were known as prayer houses, or bedehus. These are a number, as my understanding is that there are a number of these still in existence today. The idea is this was a place for prayer services and preaching. Okay. Now, Hauge, one of the first things he does is he inspires a number of other lay evangelists, and they are the ones who do the work of continuing the Hauge movement. Hauge had a very strong impact on the mission movement, both in Norway and among Norwegian Americans, and became a leading figure in the wanting to bring the gospel to the people. Now, he wrote a lot of things, but with someone who was as gifted a speaker as he was, his writings did not have the same impact on people that his presence did, his personal presence did. Now, I'm not saying that his writings weren't effective or anything else like that, but the real sense of the person, you had to experience the real sense of the person. And it was those people who read his works, who had remembered his preaching, who heard the evangelists that carried on. And this is where Haugeanism, the spirit of Haugeanism, lives on in the 19th and 20th century. He dies in 1824, so he's not a lot. It's not a long a ministry for him to be working on. And so what I'd like to do is I'd like to give the stories of 4 individuals who for whom the Hauge movement became an important part of their lives, an important element, and who continued Hauge's legacy of preaching and evangelism and outreach and mission in the 19th century and into the 20th century. So that's where we're going to be going for the bulk of our time. Now, one of the reasons that Haugeanism becomes a worldwide movement is because of the dispersion of Norwegians out of Norway and into the world. Okay, now this is going to primarily be to North America, but also into the mission fields in places like Africa and Asia. and we'll talk about how that works. The Hauge revivals are just some of the revivals that are going on among the Norwegian community, both at home and in the diaspora. In the 1850s and 1860s, there's a series of revivals by Gisela Jansen in Norway, the Jansenian revivals. Then there are more revivals in Western Norway in the 1870s, a series of revivals among the Norwegians, Americans in the 1890s, and then continuing revivals in Norway and Scandinavia after that. This leads to the formation of any number of different movements and institutions. First of all, religious societies, also schools, especially schools for mission and training of evangelists and missionaries, and very important both for overseas missions, but also missions within the country of Norway itself. So I want to look at 4 individuals. I'm going to start out by looking at Elling Eilsen. Elling Eilsen was born near Bergen, converted as a young man. He was an itinerant lay preacher in the Hauge movement in Norway as a young man in the 1820s and 30s. He was one of the areas of mission work was to the Sami people or the Lapp people in northern Scandinavia, and that was his first movement. His first preaching was to the Sami. He immigrates to the United States in 1839, which, if you know your Norwegian American history, is fairly early. All right. And he gathered the first Norwegian American Lutheran congregation in the United States. Now, what you have to know is that he was a definite personality. Okay. He was very strong. Some people would say he was stubborn. But he held to his understanding of the Hauge tradition. But the United States, the context of the United States means that Hauge himself, or Eilsen himself, is going to have to work in a different way than Hauge and the Haugians did in Norway. In Norway, you had the state church. It was this large umbrella organization. Sometimes it was open to the Haugians, sometimes it was hostile. But that was the, you had this sort of large social umbrella. In the United States, you did not have that. You did not have a state church. And so the history of the Norwegian American Lutheran groups in America is much more fragmented. Hauge probably wouldn't have wanted his followers to form separate denominations, but in the United States, it was almost necessary. And very quickly, very early on, Hauge becomes, shall I say, opposed to. That might be a polite word. He was very much in competition with and in conflict with other Norwegian American Lutheran pastors who came representing the state church tradition. Here, like I said, in America, Haugianism could not just remain a movement, although they tried. They tried to minimize the structural element as much as possible, but they were forced to take organizational form. One of the things, for example, is that Eilsen himself eventually came to believe that it was important for him to become ordained as a pastor. Now, that's not particularly what he would have had to have done in Norway. He could have remained a lay preacher. but in terms of serving congregations in America where there was no state church to provide the sacraments and other sorts of things like that, it certainly would not have been possible for him. It really would have limited his ministry. All right. In 1846, they formed the first Norwegian American Lutheran denomination, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. 1846. A group of congregations very strongly built on the on the uh, on the Hauge tradition. All right, a stress on personal conversion, a stress on lay revival preaching, a stress on the individuality of the congregations, and a strong sense of mission and personal piety. Now, this synod, this church was known informally, came to be known informally as the Nilsen Synod. Um, Interesting enough, you notice the name, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. When the ELCA, the current ELCA, was formed in 1988, they had to send somebody up to these little congregations that still existed in Wisconsin and negotiate the use of that particular name. Now, Haugeanism became a movement and a denomination, a number of congregations in North America who follow this sort of thing like this. In 1876, there was a sort of a division within the Haugean movement in America, and the large majority of them formed what was known as Hauge's Norwegian American Evangelical Lutheran Synod in 1876. Now, the Nilsen Synod remains as a much smaller group. And again, because it was necessary in America, they had to establish their own their own educational institution on Haugean lines, obviously, which was the Red Wing Seminary. And many of you know of the Red Wing Seminary or where it was. The Haugeans stood for lay preaching, simple worship, and an aversion to sort of high church clericalism and other sorts of things like this. By 1917, it represented over 120 congregations and 18,000 members. It's going to merge together with many of the other Norwegian American denominations to form the Norwegian Lutheran Church in America. And it was a small part of that merger. I think 8 or 10% of the total merger came out of the Hauge Synod. So here's the thing: how do you maintain your ideology after and your ideals after you've joined into a much larger group? And it was a constant struggle for that. This is what my student Tom's dissertation was all about. So what you see here is the Haugean movement taking root in a new religious context in North America. So that's Nilsen and his heritage. Now I'm going to move to a second Norwegian, a man named Lars Skrefsrud, who was inspired and became the premier missionary to India. He was born near Lillehammer and raised in extreme poverty, and as oftentimes was the case, he fell in his teens into a life of crime. He was imprisoned for his crimes, and he was converted in prison by reading the biography of a Swedish missionary. Very ecumenical of him. When released, he gets married to a woman named Anne Anselm, and he felt because of his faith, he felt a call to missions overseas. But because of his criminal record, he was rejected by the Stavanger Mission School, which at that point was the primary mission school in Norway. And so he's searching around. He doesn't know how he's going to do, um, how he's going to answer this call. I mean, he felt that he was called by God to become a missionary overseas, but he didn't have the support and he didn't have the training to actually do this. Um, Friends told him about a mission school in Germany, the Gosner Mission School in Berlin, and he goes to Berlin and is trained there as a missionary. And Gosner sent him to India in 1864. Now, the year 1864 might be, he joined with a Danish missionary named Hans Peder Borason in 1864 in India. Now, some of you may know that that there was a war between Germany and Denmark at this period of time, and both Borason and Skrefsrud decided that they couldn't be, as Danish, as a Dane and a Norwegian, they couldn't be affiliated with a German mission. And so they left the German mission and moved to northeastern India among the Santal people. If you can see the map there, there's this was a region that had not been particularly um, uh, serviced by Christian missionaries in the past, and Borason and Skrefsrud move into the area. And one of the things that they do, and that they were so very important for, was to learn the local languages, not only Hindi, Bengali, and Sanskrit, but also the language for the Santal people. And um, this is one of the great contributions of many of the Protestant missionaries, was not only did they bring the gospel and the Bible to people, but they brought it to them in their own languages. And oftentimes, in many cases, they had to actually create a written language for people, peoples who had never had a written language in the first place. So he publishes, besides his work with evangelizing people, he publishes a grammar for Santal people, and published a Christian songbook in Santal with local melodies. We would call this enculturation. That the gospel can be brought to people in not only their own languages but in their own cultures. And it was actually a fairly progressive thing for him to do, especially in the middle of the 19th century, because this was not always the way that things were done. He develops a thriving mission. You can see him there. He's the guy in the black frock coat, I think, and working with a group of it looks like native musicians there. He's developed a thriving mission among the Santal people with thousands of converts. And his reputation as an effective missionary grows in Norway and Scandinavia, and among the Norwegian American people. And what happens is, in a number of countries, is the development of a society called the Santal Mission, to support the work, to fund and support the work that Skrefsrud and others were doing in India. And these missionary societies were multiplied in a number of different places. But you know, there's very important, the context of this is another important element. The formation of these mission societies is an important element of the continuation of the Hauge spirit. Um, I, I'm not sure, and Gracia can correct me on this one, but the Santal Mission in the United States is, I believe now, a part of the, or affiliated with the World Mission Prayer League. The stories, the accounts of the missionary work around the world, especially Skrefsrud, is disseminated by the mission societies widely. People learn about what's going on in these countries by him. And uh, uh, he, to support his mission, he takes a number of preaching tours, both to Norway and among the Norwegian Americans, for a long period of time. And I mentioned before that 1890s revival among the Norwegian Americans. Skrefsrud preaches for 18 months across America. Now, his main point was to support the mission, but also he preaches powerful revivals in the Norwegian American community, and thousands of people are hearing him and coming to a deeper faith. He returns to India. The church eventually becomes the independent, the Northern Evangelical Lutheran Church. Here you can see a picture of some of the missionaries and some of the lay preachers, or some of the native preachers. 150,000 members in that church in northern India today. Very important. Now, here's one that I have to credit completely my colleague Gracia for, because I think it's important to understand the way in which ordinary people were grabbed by the gospel, were called to mission, were called to a deeper faith and to a life in Christ. And Gracia has written this wonderful book, and if you haven't read it, you really should, about Thea Ronning. Thea Ronning was born in Norway in 1865, confirmed at age 15, but never completely spiritually settled until she has a spiritual breakthrough in 1887. Her brother, Halvor, was a Hauge pastor in America, and Thea and her brother Nils immigrated to the United States in 1887. They are joining hundreds of thousands of young Scandinavians coming to the United States between, say, 1870 and the First World War. We tend to think of the people coming to the United States from Scandinavia in the 1850s and 1860s, and there were important groups of people, but it's mainly these young single people coming after 1870, 1880, coming to make a new life for themselves in the United States, and that was Thea and Nils. And they settle in southeastern Minnesota, and Thea herself becomes, starts working and becomes a domestic servant in Faribault for a while. So they're in this area of southeastern Minnesota, in that great belt of Norwegians stretching from, say, Kenyon up through, um, well, up to the northeast through Northfield and other and places in that direction. It was she was a deeply religious young woman, attended Haugean church. Strong interest in among the Haugians in America in overseas mission, especially the work of Hudson Taylor on the inland China. Now, many of the missionaries had been mainly along the coast, and they had lived a fairly privileged life. Hudson Taylor and his inland mission were pushing for missionaries to go into the wilds, into the not the wilds, but into the core of what China was. And the, the the news of the missionaries is exciting these Haugians in America. And they're forming mission societies, especially women's mission societies. And they're learning about the missions, they're learning about conditions overseas, and they're learning about uh, and raising money for missions. And so Thea applies to the China Mission Society to go with her brother, Halvor, to China. And you can imagine this is an audacious move for a young woman with no education. She and for her to go, and and she's as a party of missionaries is selected by the Hauge Synod and by the China Mission Society to go overseas. Halvor and Thea spend much of the fall and the summer and fall touring the congregations around the country, raising money for their mission. They arrived in China in late 1891, and they moved inland to central China, where they established their mission in the vicinity of Wuhan, what is now the city of Wuhan. And that name has become familiar to us, has it not? They started by learning Chinese, and they started to visit people in their homes. And this is where young women missionaries like Thea became extremely important. Because of the nature of Chinese societies, male missionaries could not go into the homes where there were women and children. And so Thea begins to is and the other women in missionaries in this area start going into the houses and working with the Chinese women and Chinese children and helping them with education and support. And she's writing a constant stream of articles for the Hauge Synod congregations in the United States. Conditions were very difficult. She marries a fellow missionary, a Swede, Carl Landau, in 1896, but her health was poor. And like many of these missionaries, especially in the 19th century, she died a very young woman. She died in China in 1898. But those of you who know anything at all about the Christianity in China know that um, that the survival of beside the history of China in the 20th century was full of conflict and problems. The communists came to power and tried to wipe out Christianity, and but what we know is that there's an extraordinary uh, uh, revival of Christianity in China these days, and it had its roots in young women and men like Thea who gave up their lives so that the Chinese people could hear the gospel. Last person. And this might be a little bit of a stretch, so I will apologize to Gracia. I'm not sure, but he's continuing the Hauge spirit of revivalism And this is a man named Albert Lundy, who's later than the rest of the people we've looked at, who is a revivalist in Scandinavia and in North America in the 20th or late 19th, early 20th century. He was born again into a poor family in age 17, like Thea. Is a young person. He is immigrating to Chicago. He worked in a chair factory, um, and um, and like a typical immigrant, was living whatever life he could. He fell ill and almost died. Somebody, he had no money, and of course, somebody, a Christian, paid for his medical care. Um, he attended, he went to some meetings of the revival meetings that held by the Scandinavian Salvation Army Corps in 1896. He was going there to shall I say, in an attempt to ridicule them, and he was so grabbed by the message that he became that he became uh, that he became converted at that point. He had heard of the revivalist Dwight Lyman Moody, who was whose Moody Bible Institute was very influential in Chicago. And after some training, he goes and in 1900, 1901, he goes to lead some revivals in the Dakotas. Uh, from all intents and purposes, he wasn't uh, as successful as maybe he wanted to be. Um, and partially because, as a part of his conversion, he was rebaptized as an adult, and the Lutherans tended to be hostile towards that. He returns to Norway in late 1901, and he's becoming an evangelist in Norway. His initial revivals are in Western Norway, in the Stavanger area, and then up in Bergen. Um, and like I said, he became controversial because of his rebaptism as an adult. He goes back to the United States in 1903, 1904, and leads revivals among the Norwegian Americans there, and comes back and has a series of major revivals in 1905 in Christiana. Um, he ran into a lot of opposition. He had a hard time finding a place to do his mission work, but found a place and created quite a stir with powerful preaching and thousands of conversions of people in Oslo, or in Christiana, in 1905. Now, 1905, of course, is the year of Norwegian independence. Um, I always said that if we Swedes knew that the Norwegians had oil, we'd never let them go, but that's a whole nother issue. But there's a whole stir in the country, and Lunde is making an extreme is making an impact in the heart of Norway, in the capital, in the new capital of Christiana. Further revivals follow in Norway. He founds societies in the Scandinavian countries to support mission work and evangelism. A number of tent revivals. In other words, he's bringing sort of American revivalism along the lines of Moody and Finney and people like that to Scandinavia. He does work in Stockholm, in Copenhagen, and Helsinki. In Helsinki, he manages to wangle to be a preacher in the Lutheran cathedral in Helsinki, the Nikolai Kirke, and was very active for much of the rest of his life in evangelical and mission societies in Scandinavia, and it was an important ecumenical presence in Europe and in Asia. So here are um, four people who have grabbed the sense of what is possible. They grabbed that the gospel needed to be preached, and it needed to be preached to people around the world, and that it needed to be preached, that lay people could preach and go and proclaim the word of God with power, and to preach for conversion, and to preach for a renewal of society. And it's in people like Eilson and Skresrud and Running and Lunde that the heritage of Haugeanism is maintained. So thank you for your listening to me, and I will be glad to get questions and comments from you. Maybe we maybe Gracia wants to add some things to the presentation.
So Gracia, please, if you have some comments to make, we'll give you a little bit of time and remind everyone that write your questions in the chat box because Nancy Olson will be following through with them. But Gracia, yes, thank you.
Yes, thank you, Mark. It's wonderful to hear this. It's movement, it's people, it's not institutions. It's so fundamental. And you think about tracing these, it's almost like doing family tree. Skrefsrud preached in America to thousands of people, and especially people that went into mission. For example, the Martinson family, Paul Martinson, our colleague, retired now, and Charlotte Martinson Gronseth, their grandparents heard Skrefsrud and decided to go to China. So think of that, this convict from Norway, changing the Santal, giving them their grammar and all that, coming here, and then all these people went to China, and they were all farmers' kids. Praise the Lord. It's something else.
Do we have any questions? And Nancy will field them.
At what point should I stop the recording? Should we free it up now?
We could stop it now.
Thank you.
I don't see